In a forgotten corner of the suburbs of Chicago, where asphalt melded with the gray sky and dreams dissipated into the polluted air, stood a mansion of stone and glass, imposing yet cold. It was the residence of the Andersons, a family whose fortune was surpassed only by their obsession with appearances. Richard Anderson, a businessman whose sharp gaze could cut the air like a knife, and his wife Victoria, a woman with a plastic smile and a withered heart, lived in that palace of vanities with their daughter, Isabella, a 16-year-old whose beauty was as fragile as the Murano glass adorning the halls. In that house of secrets and lies, where the walls whispered stories no one dared to tell, worked Amina, a Nigerian woman with skin as dark as the night and a smile as bright as the stars. Her calloused hands contrasted with the delicate vases she dusted day after day, while her eyes, deep wells of ancestral wisdom, silently observed the unfolding drama before her. It was on a spring morning when the cherry blossoms in the garden were dressed in pink and the air was perfumed with promises of renewal, that Victoria discovered the secret Isabella had been guarding for months. The young girl, whose belly had begun to rebel against tight dresses and impossible expectations, was pregnant. Victoria's scream resonated throughout the house, a wail that made the foundations of that fortress of appearances tremble. Richard, torn from his office by the harrowing sound, burst into his daughter's room, his face contorted with rage and shame. "What have you done?" he roared, his words lashing against Isabella's fragile figure as she curled into herself, hugging her belly as if trying to protect the life growing inside her from the coming storm. Victoria, recovering from the initial shock, began to weave a web of lies and excuses, her mind racing to find a way to conceal this blemish on the immaculate canvas of their reputation. "No one can find out," she decreed, her cold eyes fixed on her daughter, who wept in silence. While the Anderson family plunged into a whirlwind of recriminations and desperate plans, Amina cleaned in silence, her ears attuned to every word, every sigh, every threat. In her heart, a seed of compassion began to germinate, a force that would soon lead her to make a decision that would alter the course of many lives. The following days were hell for Isabella. Confined to her room, she listened to her parents argue in heated whispers, planning how to save their precious reputation. The young girl, abandoned by the father of her child and betrayed by those who should have protected her, sank into a deep depression. Richard, obsessed with maintaining appearances, refused to consider any option that could tarnish the family name. "No one must know," he repeated like a mantra, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights and days of anguish. Victoria, for her part, dedicated herself to weaving an elaborate web of lies for the outside world. Isabella had contracted a mysterious illness that required absolute rest. Visits were prohibited, calls were screened, and the young girl became a ghost in her own home. Amina watched all this with a heavy heart. Each time she entered Isabella's room to bring food or change the sheets, she felt the weight of the secret pressing on her chest. The girl's vacant stare, her eyes swollen from crying, reminded Amina of her own youth in Nigeria, the stories of so many other women trapped by circumstances and societal expectations. As Isabella's belly grew, so did her parents' desperation. Richard spent more and more time away from home, drowning his worries in work and whiskey. Victoria, a shadow of her former self, wandered the mansion's halls like a lost soul, murmuring increasingly outlandish plans. It was on a stormy night, when thunder shook the windows and rain battered furiously against the roof, that Victoria made a decision that would seal everyone's fate. With eyes gleaming with near maniacal determination, she announced that the baby had to disappear. "We'll give it up for adoption," she said, but her words concealed a far more sinister plan. Isabella, too weak and frightened to protest, merely nodded through her tears. Richard, relieved that someone else was making the decision, agreed without question. And so, on that night as dark as a wolf's mouth, the destiny of a life yet to see the light of day was sealed. Amina, hidden behind the ajar door, felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. In that moment, she made a decision that would change the course of her life and many others. She would not allow that innocent soul to suffer the consequences of the adult's mistakes and cowardice. With determination burning in her chest, Amina began to plan. Each night after the house sank into uneasy silence, the Nigerian woman would slip into Isabella's room. There, in barely audible whispers, she would speak to the baby growing in her womb, promising a future filled with love and hope. As the time for the birth approached, the tension in the Anderson mansion became unbearable. Victoria, consumed by anxiety, watched her daughter's every move like a hawk. Richard had become little more than a shadow, a man broken by the weight of a secret threatening to destroy everything. And so, in the midst of this anxious drama, destiny began to weave its invisible threads, preparing the stage for an act of love and courage that would defy all expectations and change lives forever. The day Isabella felt the first contractions, the sky over Chicago turned a foreboding gray, as if nature itself sensed the impending turmoil. Victoria, refusing to risk exposure by going to a hospital, called a questionable doctor who had agreed to keep the secret in exchange for an exorbitant sum. The doctor arrived in the dead of night, his black bag swinging ominously as he ascended the marble stairs. His eyes, cold as steel, scanned Isabella's room, now converted into an improvised delivery room. The young girl, pale and trembling, lay on the bed, her screams muffled by a pillow that Victoria pressed against her face. "It's too late for any other option," the doctor declared, his voice devoid of emotion. "The baby will be born tonight." Richard, pulled from his alcoholic stupor by the news, paced the hallway like a caged animal, muttering incoherently about family reputation and what people will say. Amina, relegated to a corner of the room, observed the scene with a heavy heart. Her strong, calloused hands yearned to comfort Isabella, to offer the support her parents denied her. But she knew that any gesture of compassion would be seen as interference, so she limited herself to praying silently, invoking the gods of her homeland to protect mother and child. The hours passed like an eternity compressed into minutes. Isabella's screams, increasingly weak, mingled with the doctor's curt orders and Victoria's hysterical sighs. Richard, unable to bear witnessing the birth, had retreated to his study, drowning his cowardice in one glass of whiskey after another. Finally, in the early hours of dawn, a sharp cry broke the mansion's silence. A small but perfectly formed baby boy had come into the world. Amina, driven by a maternal instinct that transcended blood, was the first to take him in her arms, cleaning his face with a tenderness that brutally contrasted with the coldness of the environment. But the joy of birth was fleeting. Barely had the umbilical cord been cut when Victoria snatched the baby from Amina's arms with a determination bordering on madness. The woman announced her plan. The baby would be abandoned that very night, far from there, where no one could link him to the Anderson family. Isabella, exhausted and dazed by the sedatives the doctor had administered, could barely protest weakly before falling into a restless sleep. Richard, dragged back to reality by the gravity of the situation, nodded mechanically, too cowardly to oppose his wife's plan. Amina, horrified, watched as Victoria wrapped the newborn in an old blanket and placed him in a plastic bag. The maid's pleas fell on deaf ears. "If you say a word about this," Victoria threatened, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination, "I assure you, you'll never find work in this country again." With a shattered heart, Amina observed as Richard and Victoria left the house in the dead of night, taking the baby with them. The child's cries, muffled by the plastic, seared into her memory, a sound that would haunt her nightmares for years. But Amina was not a woman who gave up easily. In her heart, forged by the harsh experiences of her life in Nigeria and her struggle as an immigrant in the United States, a flame of determination ignited. She would not allow that innocent soul to pay for the adult's mistakes and cowardice. She waited, counting the minutes that seemed like hours, until the Andersons' car returned. The silence enveloping them was more eloquent than any words. Without wasting a second, Amina pretended to finish her tasks and bid them goodnight, her mind working at full speed to plan the rescue. As soon as she stepped out of the mansion, Amina broke into a run. Guided by a mix of instinct and desperation, her feet carried her to the dumpster where she knew the Andersons had abandoned the baby. With trembling but determined hands, she searched until a faint cry indicated she had found what she was looking for. Pulling the child from the bag, Amina felt the world stop for an instant. There in her arms was the most precious life she had ever held. With tears in her eyes, she cradled him against her chest, silently promising he would never be alone again. Without wasting time, Amina headed to her modest apartment in a humble part of the city. Along the way, her mind kept racing, planning how she would care for the baby, how she would protect him from those who had rejected him. She knew the path she had chosen would be fraught with difficulties. But in her heart, there was no room for doubt. Upon arriving home, the first thing she did was bathe the little one, washing away the remnants of that terrible night from his skin. As she dressed him in clothes she had hastily bought from a 24-hour store, Amina thought of a name for the child. "Ethan," she whispered, recalling that day was the 14th of February, "because you are loved, little one, more loved than you'll ever know." That night, while Ethan slept peacefully in an improvised crib, Amina made the most difficult decision of her life. She knew she couldn't return to work for the Andersons, not after what she had witnessed. With trembling hands, she wrote a resignation letter, inventing an excuse about a new job. The next morning, with dark circles betraying a sleepless night, but with unbreakable determination in her gaze, Amina called the Anderson mansion. Victoria's voice on the other end sounded tense, almost on the verge of hysteria. Maintaining her composure, Amina communicated her decision to resign. The reaction was immediate and violent. Victoria, gripped by panic, began to plead, then threaten. "You can't leave like this! You can't leave us alone!" she screamed through the phone. Richard, pulled from his stupor by his wife's screams, joined the conversation, offering more money and empty promises of a better future. But Amina remained firm. "Don't worry," she said with a calmness that belied the storm inside her. "I'll come to collect my pay when I can." With those words, Amina hung up the phone, closing not only the conversation, but also a chapter of her life. She looked at Ethan, who slept unaware of all the drama surrounding him, and knew she had made the right decision. From that moment on, her life would be dedicated to protecting and loving the child destiny had placed in her arms. The first days with Ethan were a whirlwind of emotions for Amina. Each cry filled her with a mix of joy and fear. Joy for having the opportunity to care for this innocent life, and fear for the enormous responsibilities she had assumed. But Amina was not a woman to shrink from challenges. With her characteristic determination, she plunged into the task of raising Ethan. Sleepless nights followed, feeding the little one with lovingly prepared bottles, changing diapers with increasingly expert hands. During the day while Ethan slept, Amina frantically searched for a new job that would allow her to support her adoptive son. Fortune, a capricious lady, seemed to finally smile upon her. After weeks of relentless searching, Amina found work in a small neighborhood cafe. The owner, an older woman with a generous heart, not only offered her a modest salary, but also the possibility of bringing Ethan to work. Thus began a new routine for mother and son. Each morning, Amina would carry Ethan in an improvised baby carrier and head to the cafe. There, amid the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the murmur of conversations, the little one grew, lulled by the clinking of cups and the affection of regular customers who soon became extended family. Months passed and Ethan blossomed under Amina's loving care. His skin, white as milk, contrasted with his adoptive mother's dark complexion. But anyone who saw them together could not doubt the deep bond between them. The child's eyes, an intense blue like the summer sky, lit up each time Amina entered his field of vision. As Ethan grew, Amina faced new challenges. Each developmental milestone was a cause for celebration, but also concern. Was she doing the right thing? Could she give Ethan everything he needed? These questions haunted her on silent nights when the weight of her decisions seemed overwhelming. But with each of Ethan's smiles, each babbled word, each unsteady step, Amina found the strength to carry on. She promised herself she would do everything possible to ensure Ethan had a life full of love and opportunities, the same ones denied to him at birth. Time flew by, and before Amina knew it, it was time to enroll Ethan in school. With a tight heart, she filled out the forms, inventing a story about Ethan's absent father to avoid uncomfortable questions. Each lie weighed on her soul, but she repeated to herself it was for the boy's sake. The first day of school was bittersweet. Ethan, excited for his new adventure, barely looked back as he entered the classroom. Amina, for her part, stood at the school gate long after the bell rang, wiping away tears she didn't know if they were of pride or fear. The elementary school years passed in the blink of an eye. Ethan proved to be a brilliant student, eager for knowledge and full of curiosity about the world around him. Determined to foster that thirst for learning, Amina spent her scarce free hours at the public library, searching for books and resources to feed her son's inquisitive mind. But as Ethan grew, so did the questions. Questions about his father, about why his skin was different from his mother's, about his place in the world. Amina, torn between the desire to protect her son and the need for honesty, struggled to find answers that satisfied Ethan's curiosity without revealing the painful truth of his origins. It was on Ethan's 6th birthday when the reality of the outside world struck hard at their small bubble of happiness. At the birthday party, lovingly and painstakingly organized by Amina in the neighborhood park, one of Ethan's classmates made an innocent but devastating comment. "Why is your mom black and you're white?" The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan, confused and hurt, looked to Amina for answers. The other children, sensing the tension in the air, began to whisper among themselves. Amina, her heart pounding, took Ethan's hand and led him aside, away from curious gazes. With tears in her eyes, Amina hugged her son and spoke the words she had rehearsed for years, hoping this moment would never come. "Ethan, my love, you are the most precious gift life has given me. It doesn't matter the color of our skin. What matters is the love that binds us. You are my son, and you always will be." Ethan, with a maturity that surprised Amina, slowly nodded. "I love you, Mom," he whispered, burying his face in her chest. In that moment, under the afternoon sun and surrounded by the bustle of a children's party, mother and son silently renewed the pact of love that united them. But that incident was only the first of many. As Ethan grew, the differences between him and Amina became more evident to the outside world. Comments at school, looks on the street, uncomfortable questions from well-intentioned but insensitive neighbors, all accumulated, creating an invisible pressure on both of them. Determined to protect Ethan from the world's cruelty, Amina redoubled her efforts to create a home filled with love and acceptance. Each night after putting Ethan to bed, she sat in the small living room of their apartment, planning how to face the challenges she knew would come. She saved every penny she could, dreaming of offering Ethan an education that would open doors that had always been closed to her. Despite the obstacles, the bond between Amina and Ethan grew stronger with each challenge overcome. Far from being discouraged by taunts or malicious comments, the boy developed a resilience and compassion that amazed everyone who knew him. At school, he became a defender of the marginalized, using his intelligence and charisma to unite his peers beyond superficial differences. Amina watched her son's growth with a mix of pride and fear. Pride for the extraordinary young man he was becoming, and fear for the challenges she knew he would still have to face. Each night after Ethan fell asleep, Amina knelt beside his bed and prayed, thanking for the miracle that was her son and asking for strength to guide him on the path ahead. Years passed, and Ethan grew into a young man full of promise. At 12, he stood out not only for his intelligence, but also for his empathy and leadership ability. At school, he was admired by teachers and classmates alike, always willing to help others and fight for what he believed was right. But as Ethan entered adolescence, the challenges multiplied. The contrast between his white skin and Amina's dark complexion became increasingly evident, fueling rumors and speculations among those who could not or would not see beyond appearances. One day, after an especially difficult day at school filled with curious glances and whispered comments, Ethan came home with slumped shoulders and eyes full of unspoken questions. Amina, who had learned to read every gesture and expression of her son, knew immediately that something was wrong. "What's wrong, my love?" she asked, sitting next to Ethan on the old sofa they had rescued from the street years ago, which had now become the heart of their home. Ethan, his voice choked by emotions he struggled to control, finally gave voice to the doubts consuming him. "Mom, why do people say you can't be my real mother? Why do they laugh and say we're different?" Amina's heart broke into 1,000 pieces upon hearing the pain in her son's voice. For a moment, she considered telling him the whole truth, revealing the story of his birth and how he had come into her arms. But the fear of losing him, of that truth driving a wedge between them, paralyzed her. Instead, Amina took Ethan's hands in hers and, looking directly into his eyes, spoke with all the conviction she could muster. "Ethan, listen to me. Don't let anyone tell you who you are or who you can be. Our family is different, yes, but that's what makes it special. Love knows no colors or blood. You are my son and I am your mother, and nothing and no one can change that." Amina's words, laden with love and determination, enveloped Ethan like a protective cloak. The young man, moved by his mother's strength and sincerity, hugged her tightly, allowing the tears he had been holding back to flow freely. That moment marked a turning point in Amina and Ethan's relationship. Strengthened by his mother's unconditional love, Ethan decided he would not let others' opinions define who he was or who he could become. With renewed determination, he immersed himself in his studies, resolved to prove his worth not by the color of his or his mother's skin, but by his actions and character. Amina, for her part, redoubled her efforts to support her son. She worked extra shifts at the cafe, saving every penny to afford tutors and books to feed Ethan's thirst for knowledge. Nights grew short between work and study, but Amina found renewed energy in the light that shone in her son's eyes each time he learned something new. As Ethan advanced through high school, his reputation as an exceptional student began to spread beyond the school walls. Teachers and counselors, impressed by his intelligence and work ethic, began discussing scholarships and opportunities at prestigious universities. For Ethan, these possibilities were like windows opening to a world of opportunities he had never imagined. But with each new prospect, his awareness of the sacrifices Amina had made and continued to make for him grew. Guilt and gratitude mixed in his heart, fueling his determination to succeed, not just for himself, but for the woman who had saved and loved him unconditionally. One night, while Amina reviewed bills at the kitchen table, Ethan approached with a serious expression. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I want you to know that I'm going to get a scholarship for college, and when I become a doctor, I'll take care of you like you've taken care of me." Amina looked up from the papers, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For a moment, she didn't see the 16-year-old young man before her, but the helpless baby she had rescued so many years ago. With a lump in her throat, she stood up and hugged her son, unable to express in words the pride and love she felt. The following months were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan immersed himself in his studies with an intensity that amazed even his most demanding teachers. He spent hours in the public library, devouring books on biology, chemistry, and anatomy, determined to pursue his dream of becoming a doctor. Amina, meanwhile, faced her own challenges. Work at the cafe had become more demanding, and the long hours on her feet were taking a toll on her body. But each time fatigue threatened to overwhelm her, she thought of Ethan and the bright future that awaited him, finding the strength to carry on. The day the acceptance letter from the state university arrived, along with a full scholarship, was one of the happiest in Amina and Ethan's lives. Mother and son danced in the small living room of their apartment, laughing and crying at the same time, savoring the triumph they had achieved together. That night, while Ethan slept with a smile on his lips, Amina sat in the kitchen, looking at the acceptance letter under the lamp's dim light. Her heart swelled with pride, but also shrank at the prospect of the impending separation. The college years flew by in the blink of an eye. Ethan immersed himself in his studies with a passion and dedication that amazed professors and peers alike. Every weekend, he returned home laden with books and anecdotes, eager to share with Amina each new discovery, each small victory. Amina listened attentively to every word, marveling at the brilliant and compassionate young man her son had become. Though the long hours of work at the cafe left her exhausted, she found renewed energy in Ethan's visits, in the light that shone in his eyes when he talked about his dreams of becoming a doctor. During his final year of college, Ethan faced one of the biggest challenges of his life. An impressed professor offered him the opportunity to participate in a research program abroad. It was a unique chance, a giant step toward realizing his dreams, but accepting it would mean being away from Amina for months. The night Ethan told her about the offer, Amina felt as if the world stopped for an instant. Her first impulse was to tell him not to go, that she needed him close. But seeing the mix of excitement and doubt in her son's eyes, she knew she had to be strong for him. "You have to go," she said, fighting the lump in her throat. "This is the opportunity we worked so hard for. I'll be fine, and I'll be here waiting when you return." Ethan, moved by his mother's sacrifice and unconditional love, hugged her tightly, promising he would make her proud. And so, with his heart divided between excitement for what lay ahead and the pain of separation, Ethan embarked on his new adventure. The months that followed were difficult for Amina. Nights were long and silent without Ethan's presence, but she kept busy with work and clung to his weekly calls, in which he excitedly told her about his research and discoveries. Meanwhile, Ethan flourished in his new environment. His intelligence and compassion quickly made him a valuable member of the research team. But despite his successes, he never forgot where he came from. Each night before sleeping, he looked at Amina's photo he kept by his bed, silently thanking her for all she had sacrificed so he could be there. The day Ethan returned from his program abroad, Amina could barely contain her excitement. She waited at the airport, her heart pounding, until she saw her son emerge from the crowd. The young man walking toward her was no longer the boy she had let go months before. Ethan had transformed into a man, with a new confidence in his step and an even stronger determination in his gaze. The embrace they shared was long and intense, filled with all the feelings words couldn't express. When they finally parted, Ethan looked into Amina's eyes and spoke the words she had dreamed of hearing for years. "I did it, Mom. I've been accepted into medical school, and it's all thanks to you." The years in medical school were a whirlwind of emotions and challenges for both Ethan and Amina. The young man immersed himself in his studies with a passion bordering on obsession, determined to become the best doctor possible. He spent long nights in the library studying anatomy, physiology, and pharmacology until the letters blurred before his tired eyes. Amina, for her part, continued working tirelessly at the cafe, saving every penny she could to help Ethan with expenses the scholarship didn't cover. Though fatigue sometimes threatened to overwhelm her, she remained strong, inspired by her son's dedication and the bright future unfolding before him. As Ethan advanced in his studies, his reputation as an exceptional student began to spread throughout the faculty. Professors and peers alike admired not only his intelligence, but also his compassion and ability to connect with patients during clinical practices. During his third year of medical school, Ethan faced one of the most challenging cases of his career up to that point. During a rotation in the pediatrics department, he found himself treating a 6-year-old girl with a rare and potentially deadly disease. The little girl, scared and confused by the endless treatments and tests, refused to cooperate with the doctors. Remembering his own childhood and moments of fear and uncertainty, Ethan approached the girl with a gentleness and patience that surprised even the most experienced physicians. He spent hours sitting by her bed, explaining each procedure in words she could understand, telling her jokes, and making her laugh even in the most difficult moments. Gradually, the girl began to respond to treatment. Her improvement was slow but steady, and each small progress was celebrated by Ethan as a personal victory. When the day finally came for her to be discharged, her parents embraced Ethan with tears in their eyes, thanking him not only for saving their daughter's life, but for restoring their hope. That night, when Ethan returned home, he found Amina waiting with a special dinner. As they shared the meal, the young man told her about the girl and how her case had reminded him of the importance of compassion in medicine. Amina listened with pride, recognizing in her son's words the echo of the lessons of love and empathy she had strived to teach him over the years. As he neared the end of his medical training, Ethan faced a crucial decision, choosing his specialty. Though he was drawn to several areas of medicine, he ultimately decided on pediatrics. His experience with the sick girl had solidified his desire to work with the most vulnerable patients, those who needed not just medical attention, but also understanding and care. Graduation day was one of the most emotional in Ethan and Amina's lives. As the young man walked across the stage to receive his diploma, Amina watched from the audience with tears of pride streaming down her cheeks. In that moment, all the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights, all the moments of doubt and fear were worth it. After the ceremony, while other graduates celebrated with their families, Ethan sought out Amina in the crowd. When he found her, he hugged her tightly, whispering a thank you that contained all the love and gratitude he felt for the woman who had saved and raised him. That night, as they dined at the small restaurant they had frequented for years, Ethan handed Amina an envelope. Inside was a deed, a house in a quiet neighborhood, not far from where Ethan would do his residency. "It's for you, Mom," said the young man, his voice filled with emotion. "So you don't have to work so hard anymore, so you can rest and enjoy the life you deserve." Amina, overwhelmed by the gesture, couldn't hold back her tears. She embraced her son, remembering the helpless baby she had rescued so many years ago. In that moment, she knew that all the sacrifices, all the hardships had been worth it. Her Ethan had not only become a brilliant doctor, but also a compassionate and grateful man. The years that followed were filled with success and fulfillment for Ethan. As a pediatric resident, he quickly earned a reputation not just as a skilled physician, but as a professional deeply committed to the emotional well-being of his young patients and their families. Amina, for her part, was finally able to leave her job at the cafe and enjoy a more peaceful life in the house Ethan had given her. Though at first she felt strange without the routine she had grown accustomed to over the years, she soon found new ways to stay active and helpful. She began volunteering at the hospital where Ethan worked, reading stories to sick children and offering support to worried parents. It was during one of these volunteer shifts that Amina had an encounter that would change her life, and Ethan's, forever. While reading a story in the pediatric waiting room, she noticed an older woman observing her with a mix of curiosity and recognition. At first, Amina paid no mind, accustomed to the curious glances she sometimes received. But when she finished the reading and was about to leave, the woman approached her. "Excuse me," said the woman, her voice trembling. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Amina, intrigued by the woman's expression, nodded and followed her to a quieter corner. "My name is Victoria," the woman began, her eyes filling with tears. "I believe you worked for my family many years ago, and I believe that Dr. Ethan, the pediatrician everyone speaks so fondly of, is my grandson." Amina felt the world stop around her. All the memories of that terrible night, the abandoned baby, her desperate decision to save him, all came flooding back with overwhelming clarity. For a moment, she considered denying everything, protecting the secret she had kept in her heart for so many years. But looking into Victoria's eyes, she saw the same remorse and pain she had seen in Ethan's eyes so many times when he faced questions about his past. With her heart pounding, Amina made a decision that would change the course of their lives forever. "Yes," she said softly, "Ethan is your grandson, and I am the woman who saved him that night." Her words fell between them like stones in a pond, creating ripples that extended beyond their understanding. Victoria, overwhelmed by the confirmation of her suspicions, collapsed into a nearby chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Amina, torn between the instinct to comfort and the desire to protect Ethan, stood motionless as a storm of emotions raged within her. The days following that encounter were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult decisions for Amina. On one hand, she felt Ethan deserved to know the truth about his origins. On the other, she feared that revelation could destroy the relationship they had built over the years. Each night, she wrestled with the desire to protect her son and the growing certainty that secrets, no matter how well-intentioned, had the power to poison even the strongest bonds. While Amina grappled with this dilemma, Ethan continued his work at the hospital, unaware of the drama unfolding around him. His reputation as a compassionate and skilled doctor continued to grow, and he soon found himself leading a research team dedicated to finding innovative treatments for rare childhood diseases. It was during one of these research projects that destiny decided to intervene once more in Ethan's life. A patient was admitted to the emergency room, a man who had suffered a heart attack. The case was assigned to another doctor, but as Ethan passed by the room, something about the man's face struck him as strangely familiar. Intrigued, Ethan reviewed the patient's medical history. The name on the chart made his heart skip a beat: Richard Anderson. Though he didn't know exactly why, the name stirred an unease he couldn't ignore. He decided to take over the case personally, feeling that somehow it was important. As he treated Richard, Ethan found himself increasingly intrigued by the elderly man. There was something in his eyes, a mix of sadness and regret, that resonated deeply with him. During their conversations, Richard often looked at Ethan with an expression the young doctor couldn't decipher, as if trying to recall something important. Richard's condition was severe and required an urgent blood transfusion. However, his blood type was rare, and the hospital didn't have sufficient reserves. Without hesitation, Ethan offered to donate, discovering in the process that he shared the same unusual blood type as Richard. That night, after saving Richard's life with his donation, Ethan returned home exhausted but satisfied. He found Amina waiting for him, as always, with a warm dinner and a gentle smile. As they shared the meal, Ethan told her about the elderly patient and the strange connection he felt with him. Amina listened in silence, her heart pounding as the reality of the situation loomed. When Ethan mentioned the name Richard Anderson, she saw the color drain from her mother's face. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked, alarmed by her reaction. "Do you know this man?" In that moment, Amina knew she could no longer keep the truth hidden. With tears in her eyes, she took Ethan's hands and began to tell the story she had kept in her heart for so many years. She spoke of the abandoned baby, of her desperate decision to save him, of the years of love and sacrifice that followed. Ethan listened in shock, unable to fully process what he was hearing. His carefully constructed world seemed to crumble around him. When Amina finished her tale, a heavy silence fell between them. "Why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amina, her heart broken but determined to be completely honest, told him about her encounter with Victoria at the hospital and how Richard's appearance had precipitated this revelation. "The man you saved today, Ethan," Amina said softly, "is your biological grandfather, the same man who once decided to abandon you." Her words fell between them like a bolt of lightning, illuminating long-hidden truths and opening wounds neither knew existed. Ethan rose from the table, needing space to process this monumental revelation. He walked to the window, staring into the night without really seeing anything. Amina watched him in silence, her heart torn between fear of losing him and relief at finally having shared the truth. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan turned to her. "You saved me," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "Not just that night, but every day since. You are my mother, Amina, the only one I've ever known and the only one I need." With those words, mother and son embraced, tears of pain and relief mingling as they faced this new reality together. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Ethan. On one hand, he was grateful for Amina's unconditional love and the life she had given him. On the other, he felt a burning curiosity to know his origins, to understand the circumstances that had led to his abandonment. He decided to confront Richard at the hospital, seeking answers to the questions tormenting him. When he entered the room accompanied by Amina, the elderly man looked at them with a mix of confusion and recognition. "Dr. Ethan," Richard said weakly, "what's going on?" Ethan took a deep breath before responding. "Mr. Anderson, there's something I need to tell you. I am your grandson, the baby you and your family abandoned years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked from Ethan to Amina and back to Ethan, tears welling in his weary eyes. "Oh my God," Richard whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "All these years? How is this possible?" Ethan, with a calmness that surprised even Amina, began to recount the story of his rescue and upbringing. Richard listened, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks, the weight of his past actions visible in every line of his face. When Ethan finished, Richard extended a trembling hand toward him. "Forgive me," he implored. "I know I don't deserve it, but please forgive me. I was blinded by fear and shame and made the biggest mistake of my life. But look at you now, the man you've become. I'm so proud, so sorry." Ethan looked at Richard's outstretched hand, a storm of conflicting emotions raging within him. Part of him wanted to reject the gesture, to deny any connection with the man who had abandoned him. But another part, the part Amina had nurtured with love and compassion all these years, understood the power of forgiveness. Slowly, Ethan took Richard's hand. "I can't say I understand or that I forgive you completely," he said firmly, "but I'm willing to listen, to try to understand, not for you, but for myself and for the woman who has been my mother all these years." Amina, observing the scene with tears in her eyes, felt a mix of pride and fear. Pride for the compassionate and strong man Ethan had become, and fear for what this reunion might mean for their relationship. Richard, overwhelmed by Ethan's generosity, began to speak. He told them about that terrible night, about the fear and shame that had led them to make such a drastic decision. He spoke of the years of remorse, of how the weight of what they had done had slowly poisoned his family. "Your grandmother, Victoria," Richard said, his voice laden with emotion, "never forgave herself. She spent years searching for you in secret, hoping to somehow make amends for what we did. And now, to know you've been so close all this time, that you've become such an extraordinary man, is a miracle we don't deserve." Ethan listened in silence, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt an undeniable connection with this man, a piece of the puzzle of his identity that finally fit into place. On the other, he couldn't ignore the pain and anger that surged when he thought about how they had abandoned him. Amina, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "Richard," she said softly but firmly, "what you did was unforgivable. But fate has wanted Ethan to save you and your family, just as I saved him so many years ago. Perhaps this is an opportunity for redemption, to heal old wounds." Amina's words seemed to break an invisible barrier in the room. Richard, overwhelmed by emotion, began to cry openly, his shoulders shaking with each sob. Ethan, moved by a compassion he didn't know he possessed, approached the bed and placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "I can't promise that everything will be perfect," Ethan said, his voice laden with emotion. "But I'm willing to try, to get to know you, to understand. But you need to understand something. Amina is my mother. She gave me life in every way that matters. That will never change." Richard nodded through his tears, grateful for the opportunity he was being given. "I understand," he said, "and I'm eternally grateful to Amina for doing what we couldn't. She truly is your mother and deserves all our respect and gratitude." At that moment, as if fate wanted to underscore the importance of that encounter, Victoria entered the room. She stopped abruptly upon seeing the scene before her, her husband crying, Ethan by his side, and Amina observing with a mix of love and concern. "What's going on here?" Victoria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Richard, still with tears in his eyes, extended his hand toward his wife. "Victoria, dear, sit down. There's something you need to know." And so in that small hospital room, 4 lives intertwined by fate faced the truth they had avoided for so long. Victoria listened in shock as the story unfolded of how their grandson, the baby they had abandoned in a moment of desperation and cowardice, had become the brilliant doctor who had saved Richard's life. When the story concluded, a heavy silence filled the room. Victoria, tears streaming down her cheeks, turned to Amina. "Thank you," she said, her voice broken with emotion. "Thank you for saving him, for loving him, for giving him everything we couldn't. We can never repay you for what you've done." Amina, moved by the sincerity in Victoria's voice, nodded gently. "I didn't do it for you," she said firmly. "I did it for him, for Ethan, because every child deserves to be loved, to be protected, and he has become the son I always dreamed of having." Ethan, observing the exchange between the two women, felt something shift within him. A piece of the puzzle of his identity he didn't know was missing seemed to fit into place. Though the pain and confusion were still present, he also felt a strange sense of wholeness, as if he could finally see the complete picture of who he was. "I believe," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "that we all have a lot to process. But I also believe that maybe, just maybe, this is an opportunity. An opportunity to heal, to forgive, to build something new." Victoria and Richard nodded, tears of gratitude and remorse shining in their eyes. Amina, for her part, looked at Ethan with a mix of pride and unconditional love. In that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, the bond between them was unbreakable. The days and weeks that followed were filled with a whirlwind of emotions and difficult conversations. Ethan, with Amina's unwavering support, began cautiously building a relationship with his biological grandparents. Each meeting was a mix of pain and hope, of painful memories and the possibility of a new beginning. Victoria and Richard, aware of the undeserved gift they had been given, strove to demonstrate their remorse and gratitude. They offered Ethan stories about his biological parents, family photos, and pieces of a past he had never known, but always carefully respecting the primary place Amina held in his life. Amina, for her part, faced her own challenges. Though she knew she had done the right thing in revealing the truth, she couldn't help but feel a pang of fear each time she saw Ethan with his biological family. What if he decided he preferred them? What if the bond of blood proved stronger than all the years of love and sacrifice? But Ethan, as always, proved to be wiser and more compassionate than Amina could imagine. One night after a particularly emotional dinner with Victoria and Richard, Ethan sat with Amina on the porch of the house he had given her years before. "Mom," he said, taking her hands in his, "I want you to know something. Getting to know Victoria and Richard, learning about my origins, has been important to me. It's helped me understand parts of myself that were always a mystery. But nothing, absolutely nothing, will change what I feel for you. You are my mother in every way that matters. You saved me, raised me, loved me unconditionally. That will never change." Amina, tears in her eyes, hugged her son tightly. In that moment, all her doubts and fears dissipated. She knew that no matter what the future held, the bond between them was unbreakable. As months passed, a new dynamic began to emerge. Victoria and Richard, eager to make amends for the lost years, offered to help Ethan in his career. They had connections in the medical world that could open doors for his research on rare childhood diseases. At first, Ethan was reluctant. He didn't want it to seem like he was taking advantage of the situation or that he was somehow forgiving what they had done. But Amina, with her usual wisdom, encouraged him to reconsider. "Son," she said, "sometimes forgiveness isn't just for others, but for ourselves. Using those connections to help sick children isn't taking advantage. It's turning something that began in pain into something beautiful." Inspired by Amina's words, Ethan agreed to accept his grandparents' help. With their support, he secured funding for an innovative study promising new treatments for previously untreatable diseases. The day Ethan presented the preliminary results of his research at an international medical conference, his entire family was there to support him. Amina, sitting in the front row, looked at him with eyes full of pride and love. Beside her, Victoria and Richard listened attentively, marveling at the extraordinary man their grandson had become. When Ethan finished his presentation, the ovation was thunderous. Colleagues and mentors approached to congratulate him, predicting his work would revolutionize pediatrics. But for Ethan, the most important thing was the proud look in Amina's eyes. Amid the applause and congratulations, he sought her gaze among the crowd, finding in it all the love and support that had always been his strength. That night, as they celebrated Ethan's success in a small family-owned restaurant, the young doctor stood, glass in hand, to make a toast. "Today is a day of celebration," he began, his voice laden with emotion. "Not just for the advances in our research, but for something much more important. Today we celebrate the power of love, of compassion, and of second chances." He looked at Amina, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Mom, everything I am, everything I've achieved, is thanks to you. Your love and sacrifice saved me in more ways than one. You gave me life, a home, a future. I can never thank you enough." Then turning to Victoria and Richard, he continued, "And to you, my grandparents, thank you for having the courage to face the past, to seek redemption. Your support in this project shows that even from the darkest mistakes, something beautiful can emerge." The silence that followed his words was heavy with emotion. Amina, tears freely streaming down her cheeks, stood to embrace her son. Victoria and Richard, visibly moved, joined the embrace, forming a circle of love and forgiveness that seemed to shine with its own light. In that moment, surrounded by the love of his family, both by blood and by heart, Ethan knew he had found his place in the world, a place forged not by genetics or the circumstances of his birth, but by the choices they had made, the love they had shared, and the strength they had found to forgive and heal. The years that followed were ones of growth and transformation for all. Ethan continued to rise in his career, becoming a respected figure in the field of pediatrics. His research on rare childhood diseases saved countless lives and earned him international recognition. Freed at last from the weight of the secrets she had carried for so long, Amina flourished in unexpected ways. With Ethan's support, she resumed her studies, something she had abandoned in her youth to raise her son. At 60, Amina graduated with honors in social work, determined to help other families facing challenges similar to those she had overcome. Victoria and Richard dedicated their remaining years to trying to right past wrongs. They established a foundation in Ethan's name, aimed at supporting single mothers and children in vulnerable situations. Though they knew nothing could completely erase what they had done, they found peace in the possibility of preventing other families from making similar mistakes. The relationship between Ethan and his biological grandparents grew slowly, nurtured by mutual understanding and a genuine desire to heal. Though it never became the close relationship they might have had under different circumstances, it became valuable in its own right. A relationship based on respect, gratitude, and the shared hope for a better future. But Ethan's heart would always belong to Amina. Every achievement, every victory, every moment of joy, he shared first with the woman who had saved and loved him unconditionally. The house he had given her years before became the center of their lives, a place filled with laughter, love, and precious memories. It was in that same house one summer afternoon when Ethan received news that would change his life once again. He had just returned from a long day at the hospital when he found Amina sitting on the porch, an unreadable expression on her face. "Son," Amina said, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you." Ethan sat beside her, taking her hands in his, concerned by the seriousness in his mother's voice. "What's wrong, Mom? Are you okay?" Amina took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm fine, my love, but I received a call today. It was from Nigeria, from my hometown." She paused as if searching for the right words. "Ethan, they found your biological father." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Ethan felt as if the ground beneath his feet had vanished, leaving him floating in a void of confusion and shock. "My biological father?" he finally managed to articulate. Amina nodded, squeezing her son's hands tightly. "Yes, son. He was a Nigerian student on exchange at the university where your biological mother studied. She returned to Nigeria shortly after you were born. He never knew of your existence." Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of emotions and questions. All his life, he had assumed he would never know his biological parents. That part of his story was lost forever. And now, suddenly, a new door was opening. A new possibility of connecting with his roots. He wants to meet me?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amina nodded again. "Yes, son. He's as surprised as you are. He says he never knew he had a child. That if he had known, he would have done things differently." Ethan stood up, needing to move to process this new information. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the garden he and Amina had cultivated together over the years. Every flower, every tree was a testament to the love and care they had shared. He turned back to Amina, seeing in her eyes the same unconditional love that had always been there. "What do you think, Mom? Do you think I should meet him?" Amina stood and approached him, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. "My love, that's a decision only you can make. But I want you to know something. Nothing, absolutely nothing will change what you are to me. You are my son, my pride, my joy. If you decide to meet him, I'll be here to support you. And if you decide you don't want to, I'll understand." Ethan hugged Amina tightly, grateful once again for her wisdom and unconditional love. "Thank you, Mom. I don't know what I'd do without you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult decisions. Ethan spoke with Victoria and Richard, seeking their advice and support. Though they were surprised by the news, they offered their unconditional support, recognizing this was an opportunity for Ethan to know a part of himself that had always been a mystery. Finally, after much reflection and long conversations with Amina, Ethan decided he wanted to meet his biological father. They arranged a video call, a meeting that promised to be emotionally charged for all involved. The day of the call arrived, and Ethan sat in front of his computer with Amina by his side. her presence a constant source of strength and support. When the image of a middle-aged man with features Ethan recognized as his own appeared on the screen, the world seemed to stop for a moment. "Hello, Ethan," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "I am Adewale, your father." Ethan felt his heart pounding in his chest. "Hello," he managed to say, his own voice barely a whisper. What followed was a conversation filled with emotions, of long-held questions and honest answers. Adewale told Ethan about his life in Nigeria, about how he had never forgotten the young American student he had met so many years ago. He spoke of his shock upon discovering he had a son, of the regret for the lost years, and of his desire to know the man Ethan had become. Ethan, for his part, shared his story. He spoke of Amina, of how she had saved and raised him with unconditional love. He spoke of his achievements, his career as a doctor, the family he had formed with Victoria, Richard, and Amina. As the conversation progressed, Ethan felt a piece of the puzzle of his identity click into place. It wasn't a piece he had been actively seeking, but now that he had it, he felt more complete somehow. When the call ended, Ethan turned to Amina, who had remained silent throughout, offering her silent support. "Mom," he said, his voice laden with emotion, "thank you. Thank you for giving me the strength to do this, for always being by my side." Amina hugged him tightly, her own eyes filled with tears. "Always, my love. Always." In the months that followed, Ethan began to build a cautious relationship with Adewale. They exchanged emails and regular calls, learning about each other, filling in the gaps of a shared story they were just beginning to write. But amid this new connection, Ethan never forgot who he was and where he truly came from. Amina remained the center of his world, his rock, his true mother, in every way that mattered. A year after that first virtual meeting, Ethan made a decision. He organized a trip to Nigeria, not just to meet Adewale in person, but also to visit the village where Amina had been born. He wanted to connect with all parts of his heritage, to honor both his biological roots and the roots of love Amina had planted and nurtured throughout his life. The day before departing, Ethan took Amina for a walk in the park they used to visit when he was a child. As they walked under the trees that had witnessed so many happy moments, Ethan stopped and took his mother's hands in his. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I want you to know something before we go to Nigeria. No matter what I find there, no matter what new connections I make, or what parts of my story I discover, you are and always will be my true mother. You gave me life in every way that matters. You taught me to love, to forgive, to be strong. Everything I am, everything I've achieved, is thanks to you." Amina, tears in her eyes, hugged her son tightly. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, "you have been my greatest blessing, my greatest joy. I'm so proud of the man you've become, so grateful for every moment we've shared." As they embraced under the afternoon sun, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. His life had been full of unexpected twists, challenges, and revelations, but through it all, Amina's love had been his constant, his North Star, his home. Now, as he prepared to embark on a new chapter of his life, Ethan knew he would carry that love with him as a guiding light, illuminating the path toward whatever future awaited him. Because in the end, that was the true lesson Ethan had learned throughout his extraordinary journey. That love, true love, transcends blood and circumstances. That family is not defined by genetics, but by the bonds of the heart. And that sometimes life's greatest blessings come from the most unexpected places. As Ethan and Amina walked back home, hand in hand, the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with golden and pink hues. It was a beautiful end to a day, but for them, it was just the beginning of a new chapter in their extraordinary story of love, forgiveness, and redemption. And so, with hearts full of love and eyes set on the future, Ethan and Amina prepared for their next adventure, knowing that no matter what destiny had in store, they would always have each other. Because in the end, that was all that truly mattered. Remember, here's another story that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Remember to leave a comment. Your opinion is very important to us and helps us improve our stories day by day. Also, if you subscribe and give us a like, you're helping us bring our stories to many more people. Remember, creating stories is just as important as having people like you support us to continue. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day. See you in the next video.